Hello everyone, welcome to my video series of GitHub Copilot. In this topic, we'll try to understand the components of GitHub Copilot. So I'll talk about very basic components of GitHub Copilot and then I'll go to the somewhat in more detail. So primarily we have three components in GitHub Copilot. First is large language model, which is also known as LLM, and then context and then prompts. So one by one we'll go through these components. A large language model is something which a AI system is trained on, and this training is done based on massive amount of data, which could be text, or coding, or images or sound. We could train the large language models based on our requirement, and then that LLM is basically trained on that particular data. So GitHub Copilot uses many LLMs provided by different providers. And the advantage is that these all LLMs are trained on the coding languages or programming languages, right? So we have a lot of programming languages that are available in open source and are hosted in different open source platform. So GitHub Copilot uses all these platform and then trains the data uh, and creates these large language models. And then second is context. So large language model, as I told, is the brain behind the GitHub Copilot. But we also have to provide a context. Whenever we ask a prompt, right? A prompt is nothing but a query that we ask to the GitHub Copilot. So whenever we ask a prompt, we also give a context, like in which context are we asking this prompt. For example, write a function to do something, right? And then what does it mean? In which context does it mean that? So context is something with the files which are opened in your VS Code or the workspace that is configured in your Visual Studio Code. So those are the context. So for example, I'll just show example. So now this is a prompt, right? I mean, write a function to do some task. I mean, I'll give you a task. So now what does this mean? Where it has to write this function? So it has to write a function in this file, opened file. So by default, it will understand until we explicitly provide in which file I need to play around. It will understand that whatever file is open. For example, in this case, you can see setupAdmin.py is opened. So setupAdmin.py is a file where this prompt will run. Okay. So we understood about the context, and prompt is also the basic entity or the small entity. Prompt is nothing but a question. It is the input that you give it to model to guide its response. So prompt is a question which takes the context, and then finally the large language model understand the question based on your context and then send the response back. So this is how GitHub Copilot works, and these are the very basic components of GitHub Copilot. Okay. Coming to next sections, I'll also talk about a GitHub Copilot components workflow. So there are a lot of other components also in GitHub Copilots, and I'll explain it through a workflow diagram which I have created. So we'll start with the diagram. So just to pinpoint, I'll just use a marker also here. So as per this architecture, GitHub Copilot has three layers. So one is your client layer. So client layer is nothing but the interaction between a user developer and the Copilot IDE that we are using, right? So IDE, there are two mechanisms of using IDs. Either I can use inline suggestions in IDE or I can use IDE chat. So I'll cover these two topics. But this is how a developer or a user will interact with Copilot. So he will use the IDE plugin in GitHub Copilot. And then second layer of architecture diagram is Copilot intelligence layer. So this is where all our LLMs and other functions are hosted. So this is the brain behind the Copilot intelligence layer. So LLM model is something which is trained on large language model and large language code bases. And then we also have a model or selector router, and then prompt builder. So I'll just talk about these all components also. And then we have a third layer which is also called as governance and output layer, right? So whenever we ask question, the processing happens in this Copilot intelligence layer. And then finally the response that we get back from this processing, right? It comes as a response. But everything that comes as a response in this governance and output layer is kind of filtered. There are safety and policy filters that are configured at this layer. So different models that you can use are also configured as this level. And it also has a user tracking, like who has asked what. So we can also track that at this governance layer. So this layer is usually associated with the admins in the organization who control the GitHub Copilot configurations. Okay. So now end-to-end workflow, how it works is a user or a developer. What he does, he sees VS Code in his laptop. So VS Code is one example which I have taken as an ID, but there are many other IDs which Copilot can integrate with. So user developer sees the VS Code, and then this is where he gets the response or suggestions back. Now what happens, for example, a user or a developer asks for some particular question in VS Code. So he can ask in two ways right now. One is ID chat and inline suggestions. So I'll cover both of them. Uh, so inline suggestion is something which is done at inline level in the file level. For example, in case I have to edit this function, I can select this particular section. So this becomes my context, and just I'll press Control I. So when I press Control I, I'll see a selection bar or may kind of window open for me, and I can ask question or modify the code accordingly. So context in this case is this particular selected code, and then I can ask question to modify the selected code. So I'll go in detail in our subsequent coming videos. But for now, to understand what is inline chat or inline suggestion, this is what it means. So now this is about the our Copilot chat section. So here is where we give the prompt. So for example, just a dummy example, I'll write a function to do a certain task. So now this is my prompt. So now what context it takes? It takes the selected lines of code. Now if I have crossed it, it will take this complete file as a context plus associated files which are available in my workspace. But primarily the context is the associated file, right? So this is what GitHub Copilot chat says about. So ID chat is GitHub Copilot chat, and inline suggestion is an inline suggestion that you get at ID level. Once we have asked a question or a query or a prompt to GitHub Copilot, the prompt is built basically. I mean, it will have a lot of other details also. So prompt is something which is we have asked. Now prompt will also be formed with respect to context. So whatever files are opened in my ID, whatever files are available in my VS Code, right? So those also are also taken into consideration. So this is what Copilot will talk about. And then we also have custom instructions. This is somewhat advanced, but I'll just touch base upon this one. So you can also have your personal preferences while asking any question. You can also have a repo indexing in case you are using GitHub for your repo hosting. So there's an automatic indexing that happens at your version control level. And then you can also have an organization level control. So whatever prompt you're asking, those organization level filters can also be embedded inside it. And then once you have this thing, so there's something called as model or selector. So there are a lot of LLMs which are available right now with Visual Studio Code. for example, I'll come back again to VS Code. So there are a lot of LLMs which are available, a lot of models that are available right now. So for example, I have Claude, which is from Anthropic, and GPT, which is from OpenAI, and then even Gemini models are available, and GPT models are available. So now, when I ask a question, right? So which model the particular query should select? So it depends on whatever selection we give. But we could also have an automatic selection based on our prompts. So automatically it will. It is always recommended to use lighter models which are less expensive in case of very basic tasks. But in case you are using very heavy duty task or which require a lot of calculations, computations, and then research, you could definitely try adding these higher models. But the cost is more in this case. Okay. So this is what is about model selection. So you could select those models based on whatever input is required, whatever type of query you have. And there's something called as agents and MCP tools. So agent is something a new concept now. We will cover in detail what is an agent. We will also talk about MCPs. So MCPs is something we'll have. Yeah. And then once we have all these Copilot intelligence, right? So it finally generates the response. And the response is something which is being filtered in case any appropriate questions are asked. So based on that, the Copilot will give a response which is kind of complying to security and safety policies of an organization and also the usage tracking and other things. So these all layers are covered and finally the user gets a response back. So this part covers how a user interacts with your ID and what happens in the background and what are different layers of GitHub Copilot architecture. Okay. So thank you for staying with me till the last of the video. So we'll cover other topics in the next video. Thank you everyone.